Jason's talking to you.
You okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. In the 2 days prior to when we were captured at the checkpoint, we were trying to figure out what was happening in terms of various incidents, various shootings. But we also had a wider investigation about whether there were actual Russian citizens involved in the pro-Russia forces in eastern Ukraine. That's one of the big questions that a lot of people have been trying to answer for themselves and haven't been able to answer for themselves definitively, and that's what we were looking into. And on reflection, I think maybe that's what got them angry with us specifically. On Monday, I'd gone to a press conference in the morning outside of the Ukrainian Security Services building, which has been now taken over by the pro-Russia separatists. And they wheeled out a Ukrainian activist slash journalist called Irma, who was let out and blindfolded, and then the blindfold was taken off her and she gave an interview to a bunch of journalists.
Добровольно?
А?
Ну, по этому разговору только что, значит, вы
Нет,
здесь находитесь по договоренности?
я бы хотела, допустим, отсюда уйти. Ну, я скажу так, как журналист, я даже довольна, что попала в полон, потому что я хочу увидеть вот этот весь процесс и написать журналистское даже расследование, как все это было.
Да, не вопрос. Несколько вопросов.
Для чего вы держите Ирму Крат?
Мы не держим Ирму Крат. Она у нас приглашенный гость.
And then in the afternoon at around 5 p.m., they were organizing a press conference in the city administration. We went into the press conference and it was one of the strangest press conferences that I'd ever been in because it consisted of Stella and another woman. And then the mayor telling all of the journalists that if they were caught lying, that they would be expelled from the city and that they would be watching our work and that they'd taken our names down and that they know who we are and so we better be careful what we say.
Хочу предупредить журналистов, мы собрали ваши данные еще и для того, чтобы отслеживать, какую информацию вы преподносите.
Что многие из вас, здесь присутствующие, говорят всему миру неправду. Мы сегодня вас всех записали, и если где-то что-то будет замечено, вы будете лишены права вообще находиться в городе. Нам предатели не нужны.
Вы угрожаете, да? Нет, просим, мы предупреждаем за клевету. Что за клевету?
Угрожать мы не можем.
Скажите, какова судьба бывшего мэра Нелли Степа? Где она находится? Если можем ли мы ее увидеть?
Она находится под нашей охраной. Представители ОБСЕ видели ее, встречались с ней, задавали вопросы. А я вам еще раз говорю, она не задержана, она не удерживается. Она находится под нашей охраной. И если вам интересно перекручивать факты и мои слова, то для того, чтобы этого не повторилось, я еще раз говорю, я вас попрошу удалиться из зала. Еще один вопрос провокационного характера, я буду вынужден это сделать.
Maybe actually that was the weirdest press conference ever. Most of what he was saying was directed towards the journalists, telling us that if we were to be caught lying, then we would be thrown out of town. At one point, he wouldn't let some journalists leave. He said we had to go out as a group, and some soldiers just deleted some photographs from our camera because we'd taken some pictures of some of the gunmen without their masks on. I think it's really heating up here for journalists. We've been working around town openly as press the entire time without any problems outside of the usual, people saying don't take pictures and getting in our face. But when we were returning home from filming that night back to the hotel in Slavyansk, there's a few checkpoints between Kramatorsk and Slavyansk that we went through that was perfectly fine. We had a Russian journalist with us who waived his Russian press credentials and that helped us get through checkpoints. But when we got to the final checkpoint, which was literally maybe 300, 400 yards away from our hotel, a man pulled a piece of paper out of his pocket with my face on it, shined a light on my face, showed it to his friends. His face lit up and he's like, I got him, this is him. And so they just opened the car door, pulled us all out of the car, lined us up in a row next to the car, and then led us away into an alleyway nearby, where they lined us up again and went through our pockets, asked everybody what their nationality was. And there was a group of, I don't know, it's hard to say, but maybe about 10 people who were sort of circling around us with weapons and threatening us. And there was one guy who actually had a machete and said, let's cut off his leg. And then there was another guy with a shotgun who said, let's shoot him right here. And then there was a couple of other guys who were saying, no, we have to take him to the SBU building, which is the Ukrainian State Security Services headquarters that's now been taken over by the pro-Russia forces. And it was really frightening, I have to admit, and really eerie, because as we were being lined up in that alleyway, a black Volga sedan was being unloaded, and somebody was pulling out what looked like a body from the back of the car. But I think it may have been somebody who was alive but was just being transported in the trunk of the car. And then the other 4 journalists, including Freddie, Simon Schuster, and a Russian and Ukrainian journalist, were sort of left behind, and I was put into the same Volga that they had just pulled a person out of the back of just moments earlier. And they drove me silently to the SBU headquarters, which are just about a couple minutes away from where the checkpoint was. And they led me out to the courtyard behind the SBU building, and that's when things got really rough. What happened first was they pulled a hat over my eyes, then went through all of my pockets, took everything I had out of my pockets, took my coat off of me, threatened to make me get on my knees, didn't end up making me get on my knees, and then they taped my hands behind my back, and threatened to shoot me a couple of times. The whole procedure seemed like its purpose was to intimidate me as much as possible. So I was led down the stairs into the basement of the SBU with my hands tied behind my back and blindfolded, and I was thrown down onto the floor of the cell and made to sit in a corner, and then eventually I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 people came in and started beating me up on the floor, and I rolled over and tried to protect myself, and they were kicking me and punching me in the ribs and hitting me on the head, on the ears with open palms, which is pretty painful and shocking and creates like this effect of a photo flash in your brain, but doesn't actually leave any lasting damage. And I think everything they were trying to do was to hurt me enough to make me scared, but not hurt me bad enough for me to have any lasting damage that they could get blamed for in the future. And I think I kind of recognized that pretty early on, and realized that they weren't punching me in the face and they weren't trying to leave any marks on my body. And that was actually very encouraging, and I sort of thought to myself, well, I mean, I can probably take a beating, and if that's as bad as it's going to be, then this isn't going to be so bad after all. But there was also a lot of, I didn't know for sure. Those were the kinds of things that I was telling myself. But they also did everything that they could to make the first night as horrific as possible. Every half an hour or so, somebody would come in and ask me some questions, ask me about my ethnic background, ask me if I was a spy, tell me that they could easily kill me if they wanted to, and then leave me alone for another half an hour. The effect was that every time I heard footsteps in the corridor walking by, I was wondering whether they were going to come in and like kick me again or do something to me. So it was actually pretty terrifying. Halfway through the night, I asked him if I could have my hands retied in front of my body, and he sort of leaned me forward and took a knife out and told me that they had a machine gun trained on my head, and that if I made a false move, then my head would fall apart. He cut the tape on my hands, and then they retied my hands in the front of my body, and as they were doing that, they were both very close up to me and holding me, and my hands were actually pressed right up against the AK that the guy was holding. and then they left me alone for a few hours, and I kind of slept after that until I don't know what hour it was, because I had no idea whether it was even light or dark in the room. I thought I was in a totally pitch dark room, but eventually when I sort of gathered up a little bit of courage, I pushed the hat a little bit up my nose so that there was a crack of light between at the bottom of the hat, and then I could see that the room that I'd actually been in this entire time, that I thought was just a dark basement cell, was actually totally lit up the entire time. It was a really filthy room with a sort of roll-up mattress that was half rotted away, and a coat that I had been put on in the corner. And the walls were so damp that the plaster was coming down like as if it was sand every time you moved on it. And there was water from condensation dripping from the ceiling the entire time, so it was really hard to find a position where you wouldn't get dripped on. That's how I spent, I guess, the first day and a half on my own until other people, other detainees were put into the same room with me.
В камере предварительного задержания.
А зачем вы его держите?
А?
А зачем вы его держите?
Чтобы он не давал провокационных комментариев.
I found out afterwards that the mayor had been feeding journalists at press conferences all kinds of reasons for my disappearance, I think none of which were true, and he was also trying to keep everybody on their toes about where I was actually being held, so nobody was sure 100% whether I was abducted or if I was abducted, where I was being held, and part of the reason was because he was saying that I was actually on an exclusive assignment to write a story about the goings-on inside the SBU, which was totally untrue.
Вы вчера сказали, что он делает материал, а что изменилось сегодня? Почему?
Правильно, он собирает материал у нас на КПЗ, чтобы потом поделиться с вами, когда мы туда выйдем.
А когда надо?
Когда надо будет, тогда и выйдем. Когда мы посчитаем нужным, его выпустим. Я вам скажу следующее, послушайте меня внимательно. Почему никто из вас не обращает никогда внимания на то, что в следственном изоляторе СБУ находится очень много наших активистов? В частности, Павел Губарь, народный губернатор Донецкой области. Почему вы не обостряете на этом внимание, а на каком-то журналисте-провокаторе?
It was funny because one of the guys actually mentioned the Geneva Convention to me. He told me that, according to the Geneva Conventions, they were required to give me food, water, and cigarettes if I asked. And they did, so if I wanted water, they gave me water. If I wanted food, I never asked for food, they just brought food regularly. I wasn't hungry.
Он нормально питается, он содержится в нормальных условиях, он чистый, помытый, то есть,
Он журналист.
так еще теперь.
After about a day and a half, some other detainees were moved into the small cell that I'd been in with me, and they made me feel much more relaxed about what was going on because they told me what I could expect. They were the guys who let me know that I hadn't actually had my real interrogation yet. They were like, "Oh, they haven't questioned you in the other room? Oh, well, that's going to happen. You might get beaten up," kind of thing. There were two sort of groups of guards that we had, maybe even three. There were our caretakers who were unarmed and wearing civilian clothing. Then there were a group of guards who were definitely locals from Slovyansk, the town itself, who had ragtag camouflage clothing that they'd managed to put together themselves. And then there was a higher group of what everybody in the cellar called the special ops guys, spitsi. And they're what's also called the little green men, that everybody suspects to have some kind of ties to Russia, but nobody has been able to prove it yet. To me, I couldn't verify 100% for myself whether they were Russian or not. They sounded like they had southern accents to me, which could be Ukrainian or from southern Russia. My true feeling about the people who were dealing with us was that they were members of, military veterans who had been member of some kind of organization together even before this conflict began. They had this sort of nationalist, religious, fundamentalist, Orthodox Christian ideology that they kept talking about. Eventually a man came in, one of the special ops guys, as we called them, woke me up and asked me for my computer's password. And I got up and I told him I was very sorry, but I couldn't give him my computer's password. He said, okay, well, you want to do this the hard way? You can wait for the hard way. And so he left the room, and then I sort of waited for another hour and a half until he came back. You know, one of the other guys was like, ooh, you shouldn't have done that. You're going to get it pretty bad now. But I think that was the whole point of not doing anything immediately, was to sort of make me soak in my own expectation of the bad things that are going to happen to me because I refuse to cooperate. So he eventually came back, and they took me into the other room and they sat me down on a box, and I was blindfolded again. First he asked me what the computer password was, and I refused to give it to him again, and then the other guy who was with him used a truncheon to smack me on the arm. And then he told me that they'd already cracked my computer anyways, and they didn't need the password from me, and that I'd failed their test. And then he asked me if I worked for the CIA, if I worked for the FBI, if I was working for the Kiev government, if I was a spy for the right sector. And I said I wasn't, and he asked me if I was sure. I said I was sure. And it was actually a pretty short interrogation, and besides getting hit on the arm with the police baton, it wasn't that bad or intense. And I'd already spent almost 2 days by that stage there, and I think they'd already figured out what the real situation was, and they were just ticking boxes. Okay, we've got a detainee, we've got to interrogate him, we've got to ask him the usual questions, and it sort of lasted about 10 minutes, and then they left the room, and they left me in that room to spend the night. So that night I spent alone in the big room. The main change in the atmosphere of the building happened on Thursday, the day of my release, when I didn't know at that point why this was happening, but most of the gunmen had left the SBU building. What I found out later in the day was, when the gunmen came back, was that there had been a gunfight and that the Ukrainian troops were moving into town. And so they were preoccupied with that, and even when we were asking them if we could go to use the toilet, they told us that they really didn't have time for us today. And so I think that that also might have had something to do with my release, because they were so busy with the security situation changing on the ground for them, that they thought that having me around was maybe just too much, more trouble than it was worth. Roman, one of the caretakers, came down and told me, get your things, you're going, but he didn't actually give me my things. And he led me upstairs, and there was a cameraman from the Rossiya television station, which is a Kremlin-backed state-owned media. And this Russian reporter interviewed me. His name was Yevgeny Popov. He wanted to know how I'd been treated, what my political views were. He said that I'd been accused of being a right sector spy. Was that true? And then, when I told him how I'd been treated, he didn't really want to dwell on that, because that didn't make for good news in Russia, that the pro-Russia forces were beating and taking people hostages. And so he tried to shift the conversation to my view of the political situation in Ukraine overall, and whether I agreed that it was the Western-backed junta in Kiev that was being sponsored by the Western governments to foment this conflict, and what the West's role was in fomenting the conflict, and what my opinion was of the Kiev authorities. And he was trying to tease out my political position. I don't even know if he published that story, because I felt like I didn't say anything that would have made good propaganda for them. So what they did was they said, you're being released, wash your face, comb your hair. And then they led me up to a cameraman. So they'd tricked me, basically. And then out of the blue, sort of around 5 or 6 p.m., Roman came down with a plastic bag full of my things and said, you're free to go. Then I just walked through the barricade with my little plastic bag, and walked past a group of gunmen. I went around the corner in the direction of the hotel and immediately bumped into a crew from the Canadian Broadcasting Company. I walked up to their car and they saw me and they said, "We've been looking for you everywhere. Give us a real quick interview."
We have an exclusive then.
You have a bit of an exclusive, but if you can drive me home, that'd be even more of an exclusive.
We'll do that. So how's the situation?
It's fucked up. Spent 4 days in a basement with like 3 or 4 other guys. They kept bringing in new people from the street, drunks, like drug people, like people who were high, and then activists and people from other parts of Ukraine. Some people would be held for like a day. Some people would be held for longer.
You probably don't want to stay there much longer.
I don't want to stay in Slavyansk unless I can get an official press accreditation from the mayor. They're apparently giving those out. And then maybe come back and work here now that they know me.
But did you know
maybe it'll be okay.
Did you know what did anybody help secure your release or something? Or?
I have no idea. I literally just got out 5 minutes ago. Okay. Allo, Dina. They put me in their car, and their security guard put me in the back of the car and told me to take my glasses off and to put on a beanie hat when we were going through checkpoints. I feel really great to be released, and you know, I wasn't hurt badly. I was just beaten a couple of times, which is bearable, but I feel really bad for the people who are still being held there. Some of them have been held for like 2 weeks. There's a journalist there, just a local guy who wanted to set up a webcam across the street from the building that we were being held in, and that's the reason he was captured. And there was another guy who was from the Euromaidan protests who came to town with some right sector people, and he was roughed up pretty bad, and he's been in there for like about a week now, I think. That's crazy. The mayor said that that I'm still detained. That was the latest thing that he said.
Yeah, last word.
Fucking crazy.
Maybe he's right.
You just don't know.
We just don't know.